The Invisible Man, 1897 by H. G. Wells, is a science fiction novel that revolves around a brilliant yet morally questionable scientist, Griffin, who discovers the secret of invisibility. The story is a compelling mixture of suspense, horror, and science fiction, exploring themes of isolation, power, the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition, and the loss of humanity. Wells' novel is a classic example of early science fiction, a genre he helped shape, and it delves into the human psyche by asking what happens when a person gains great power but loses their humanity in the process. Griffin's descent from a gifted scientist to a monstrous figure consumed by power and paranoia is central to the novel's exploration of moral degradation. The novel also critiques the consequences of pursuing knowledge without ethical restraint and the alienation that can come with intellectual isolation. Arrival of the Stranger. The novel opens with the arrival of a mysterious stranger in the small English village of Iping. He is heavily bandaged and cloaked, covering himself completely, and refuses to reveal his face or identity. He takes up residence at the Coach and Horses Inn, where his odd behavior and demand for solitude immediately arouse the villagers' suspicion. The stranger spends most of his time in his room, conducting experiments with a variety of chemicals and scientific equipment. Mrs. Hall, the innkeeper, is frustrated by his refusal to pay rent or engage with others, but he insists on being left alone. The reader quickly learns that the stranger is Griffin, a scientist who has discovered the ability to make himself invisible. However, his success has come at a great cost. He is now unable to reverse the process and has become increasingly isolated and paranoid as a result. His invisibility allows him to move unseen, but it also renders him incapable of living a normal life. Griffin's physical invisibility becomes a metaphor for his increasing emotional and moral detachment from society. Griffin's growing hostility. As time passes, Griffin's behavior grows more erratic and hostile. When Mrs. Hall demands payment for his stay at the inn, he reacts violently, throwing objects around the room and causing chaos. The villagers become increasingly suspicious of him, and their fear escalates when a burglary occurs with no apparent culprit. It becomes clear that Griffin is using his invisibility to commit crimes, further alienating him from society. The turning point comes when Griffin finally reveals his invisibility during a confrontation with the villagers. His bandages and clothing are ripped off and he flees into the countryside, leaving the villagers in a state of shock. From this moment on, Griffin is fully exposed as the Invisible Man, a figure of both terror and fascination. His actions become more dangerous as he embraces his invisibility as a means to exert power over others, free from the constraints of social norms and morality. Griffin's backstory. After fleeing Iping, Griffin seeks refuge in the nearby town of Port Burdock, where he encounters a homeless man named Thomas Marvel. Griffin, using the threat of violence, coerces Marvel into becoming his unwilling accomplice. Marvel is forced to help Griffin retrieve his scientific notebooks and other belongings, but he quickly realizes the danger of associating with Griffin and begins plotting his escape. As Griffin's plans unfold, the reader is given insight into his backstory through a conversation with Dr. Kemp, a former colleague. Griffin reveals how he discovered the secret of invisibility. As a young and ambitious scientist, he became obsessed with the idea of making living tissue invisible. After years of experimentation, he finally succeeded in turning himself invisible by manipulating the refractive index of his body, rendering it imperceptible to light. However, Griffin's success came at a great personal cost. He burned down his lodgings to cover his tracks and severed all ties with his past life, plunging himself into a state of isolation. Initially, Griffin believed that invisibility would grant him ultimate freedom and power, but he soon discovered the many challenges and limitations that came with it. Unable to reverse the process and increasingly cut off from society, Griffin's mental state began to deteriorate, and he became consumed by anger and a desire for revenge against a world that he felt had wronged him. The Reign of Terror. After recounting his story to Kemp, Griffin reveals his ultimate plan. He intends to unleash a reign of terror on society, using his invisibility to instill fear and gain control over others. Griffin's descent into madness is complete at this point, as he no longer sees himself as bound by any moral or ethical considerations. He believes that his invisibility gives him the right to dominate and subjugate those around him, and he is willing to use violence and intimidation to achieve his goals. Kemp, horrified by Griffin's plans, decides to betray him and contacts the authorities. However, Griffin is not easily subdued. He embarks on a violent rampage, using his invisibility to evade capture and terrorize the people of Port Burdock. His ability to move unseen makes him nearly impossible to stop, and the townspeople live in constant fear of his next attack. Griffin's actions highlight the dangerous consequences of unchecked power, as his invisibility allows him to act with impunity, free from the constraints of societal rules. Griffin's downfall. Despite his formidable power, Griffin's arrogance and overconfidence ultimately lead to his downfall. Kemp, working with the local police, devises a plan to capture Griffin. Using clever tactics and setting traps, the authorities manage to corner Griffin and force him into a confrontation. In the final, dramatic chase, Griffin is fatally wounded by a mob of enraged villagers who have banded together to stop his reign of terror. As he lies dying, Griffin's body slowly becomes visible once more, a symbol of his complete and utter defeat. His invisibility, which once seemed like the ultimate source of power, is revealed to be his undoing. In the end, Griffin is reduced to a tragic figure, a man who sacrificed everything in his pursuit of knowledge and power, only to lose his humanity in the process. Themes and motifs: isolation and alienation. One of the central themes of The Invisible Man is isolation, both physical and emotional. Griffin's invisibility serves as a metaphor for his increasing detachment from society. As he becomes more consumed by his scientific ambitions, he isolates himself from his colleagues, family, and society at large. His invisibility, while granting him freedom from physical constraints, also traps him in a state of perpetual loneliness and alienation. Griffin's inability to connect with others leads to his moral decline, as he becomes increasingly bitter and vengeful. The novel also explores the theme of alienation through the reactions of the villagers and townspeople. Griffin's invisibility makes him a figure of fear and suspicion, further isolating him from those around him. The more he tries to exert power over others, the more he becomes an outsider, cut off from any sense of community or belonging. The dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. Another key theme in The Invisible Man is the danger of scientific ambition that is pursued without regard for ethical consequences. Griffin's discovery of invisibility is a monumental scientific achievement, but his lack of moral restraint leads to disastrous consequences. In his quest for knowledge and power, Griffin disregards the potential harm his experiments could cause to others. He sees himself as superior to those around him and believes that his scientific prowess gives him the right to act without accountability. Wells uses Griffin's story to caution against the dangers of unchecked scientific progress. The novel raises important questions about the role of science in society and the responsibilities that come with great power. Griffin's downfall serves as a warning of what can happen when scientific discovery is divorced from ethical considerations. Power and corruption. The novel also explores the corrupting influence of power. Griffin's invisibility grants him extraordinary power, but it also leads him down a dark and destructive path. Freed from the constraints of visibility and accountability, Griffin becomes increasingly arrogant and violent. He believes that his invisibility makes him untouchable and that he is entitled to use his power to dominate and control others. However, Griffin's lust for power ultimately leads to his downfall. His inability to see beyond his own desires and ambitions blinds him to the consequences of his actions. The novel suggests that power, when unchecked, can corrupt even the most brilliant minds, turning them into dangerous and destructive forces. The consequences of dehumanization. Griffin's transformation into the Invisible Man is not just a physical one, it is also a psychological and moral transformation. As he becomes more detached from society, he loses his sense of humanity. His invisibility allows him to act without fear of consequences, but it also strips him of his moral compass. Griffin's dehumanization is complete by the end of the novel, as he becomes a figure of pure malice, driven by a desire for revenge and domination. Wells uses Griffin's story to explore the consequences of dehumanization. The novel suggests that when individuals lose their connection to society and morality, they risk becoming monstrous figures capable of great harm. Conclusion: The Invisible Man is a powerful exploration of the dangers of unchecked ambition, power, and isolation. Through the character of Griffin, H.G. Wells delves into the psychological and moral consequences of scientific discovery, raising important questions about the role of science in society and the ethical responsibilities that come with great power. Griffin's descent into madness and violence serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing knowledge and power at the expense of humanity. At its core, The Invisible Man is a story about the human condition and the consequences of losing one's connection to society and morality. Griffin's tragic fate is a reminder that no amount of power can compensate for the loss of humanity, and that the pursuit of knowledge must always be tempered by ethical considerations. The novel remains a timeless work of science fiction, offering both a thrilling narrative and a profound commentary on the dangers of power and isolation. Created for Squeeze That Book channel, please subscribe to follow new videos. And leave a comment with your thoughts about the book.